The air in the high Sierras has a quality you can't find anywhere else on Earth. It's thin, sharp, and smells of ancient granite, pine resin, and a profound cathedral-like silence. For 20 years, these mountains had been my church, my laboratory, and my sanctuary. I was a geologist, a woman who understood the world through the language of rock and time. I could read a story in a seam of quartz, predict the temper of a fault line, and find a strange, deep comfort in the patient, unyielding presence of the stone. I understood the mountains. I thought I understood the man walking beside me, too. That was my gravest miscalculation. His name was Liam. For 5 years, he had been the brilliant, charming counterpoint to my quiet academic life. I was a creature of data, of rock hammers and topographical maps. Liam was a creature of ambition, a self-proclaimed visionary entrepreneur who spoke in the soaring language of disruption and paradigm shifts. His ventures were always grand, always on the cusp of a breakthrough that never quite materialized. There was always a funding round that fell through, a partner who backed out, a market that wasn't quite ready for his genius. I supported him. My university salary, supplemented by consulting fees for major mining corporations, provided the stable ground from which he could launch his rockets to the moon. I believed in his dreams, even when they consistently failed to achieve orbit. He was handsome, with a smile that could disarm billionaires, and a passion that felt like its own form of energy. He loved my work, or so I thought. He would listen for hours as I explained the complex dance of tectonics or the subtle clues of mineral deposits. His eyes shining with what I mistook for genuine fascination, he called me his Earth Whisperer. The discovery that would ultimately become my tomb, and then my crucible, was one I made not for profit, but for pure science. Deep within the notoriously unstable and remote section of the Sierra Nevada, a place that old-timers called the Dragon's Teeth, my seismic sensors picked up an anomaly. It was a geothermal signature unlike any I had ever seen, coupled with a unique magnetic resonance that hinted at a massive, super-concentrated deposit of rare earth metals, specifically neodymium and terbium. It wasn't just a mine. It was a treasure chest. A deposit of that purity and size could reshape the global technology market, from electric vehicles to wind turbines. It was a discovery worth billions. When I showed the data to Liam, his reaction was electric. His eyes, usually filled with a restless, searching energy, became laser-focused. This was different from his usual fleeting enthusiasm. This was a deep, consuming hunger. "Aris, my God," he breathed, his hands tracing the contour lines on my map. "Do you understand what this is? This isn't just another discovery. This is it. This is the one." Our one, he became obsessed. He spent weeks drafting business plans, creating a shell corporation he called Apex Minerals, and talking about investors he had on speed dial. I was swept up in his excitement. He made it feel like a partnership, our discovery, our future. He insisted we keep it an absolute secret until he had the initial funding secured. "We can't let one of your corporate clients get wind of this. Aris," he'd said earnestly, "they'll bury us in litigation and steal it right out from under us. This has to be ours." It sounded like he was protecting me, protecting us. The final step, he argued, was a physical survey. We needed to go there, ourselves, to plant a marker, to get core samples that were indisputable. A multi-day hike into the heart of the Dragon's Teeth. He framed it as a romantic adventure, a return to the wilderness we both loved. "Just the two of us, Ari," he'd said, kissing me, "like old times. We'll conquer the mountain and claim our future together." I should have seen the warning signs. They were there, as subtle as a shift in barometric pressure before a storm. He packed his own gear with a meticulous, almost military precision, his pack far heavier than necessary for a 3-day hike. He bought a new satellite phone for emergencies, he said, though he never gave me the number. And the look in his eyes when he studied the maps, it wasn't the look of a partner. It was the look of a conqueror, a man plotting a campaign. But I was blinded by love, by the shared dream he had so expertly woven around me that the hike was arduous. We left the maintained trails behind on the first day, navigating by compass and GPS into the raw, untamed wilderness. The jagged peaks of the Dragon's Teeth loomed over us, magnificent and menacing. On the second day, as we scrambled over a high windswept ridge, a storm rolled in with terrifying speed. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the temperature plummeted. "I know a place," Liam shouted over the rising wind. An old ranger's cabin. It's on the map. We can shelter there until this passes. He led me down a steep, treacherous slope into a dense grove of ancient pines. Tucked away, almost invisible against the mountainside, was the cabin. It was a relic from another time, built of thick hand-hewn logs, with a heavy plank door and small, shuttered windows. It looked less like a shelter and more like a fortress. Inside it was dark and smelled of cold stone and forgotten years. There was a stone fireplace, a rickety table, and a single bunk bed. It was primitive, but it was a shelter. As the storm raged outside, Liam built a fire. He was strangely quiet, his earlier excitement replaced by a tense, coiled energy. He handed me a flask of whiskey. To the future, he said, his voice oddly formal. I took a sip, the warmth spreading through my chest. The last thing I remember clearly is the crackle of the fire and the strange, metallic taste of the whiskey. My eyelids grew heavy. The room began to swim. I remember slumping against him, mumbling something about being so tired. And I remember his voice, no longer warm and loving, but cold and distant, like a voice on the other end of a long distance. Call. Just rest, Uri, he said. You've done your part. I woke up to silence. A profound, suffocating silence that was deeper than the absence of sound. The fire was dead, a pile of gray ash on the hearth. The cabin was plunged into a deep, chilling twilight. My head throbbed, a dull, chemical ache that was different from a normal hangover. I was lying on the dusty floor, a coarse wool blanket thrown over me. I staggered to my feet, my body feeling heavy and uncooperative. Liam, I called out, my voice a dry croak. No answer. His pack was gone, so was the satellite phone. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, began to seep into my bones. I stumbled to the heavy plank door and pushed. It didn't budge. I threw my shoulder against it. It was like hitting a wall of solid rock. Panic, sharp and electric, shot through me. I ran to the small windows. The heavy wooden shutters were closed, and when I felt along the edges, I realized they had been nailed shut from the outside. I was locked in. My mind reeled, refusing to accept the impossible. There had to be a mistake. He'd gone for help. He'd be back. But then I saw it. Lying on the rickety table was my geological map, my map, and scrawled across it in Liam's familiar, confident handwriting was a single brutal message. I'm sorry it had to be this way. This discovery is too important for a partnership. Consider this your final quiet contribution. Oh, the words swam before my eyes. The air was sucked from my lungs. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a meticulously planned execution. He had brought me to the most remote place he could find, waited for a storm to cover his tracks, drugged me, and sealed me in a log cabin to die of starvation or exposure. He hadn't just left me, he had buried me alive. The silence of the mountains, my lifelong sanctuary, was now the sound of my own tomb. The first 24 hours were a blur of primal terror. I screamed until my throat was raw, a useless, pathetic sound swallowed by the thick log walls and the vast, indifferent wilderness. I pounded my fists against the unyielding door until they were bruised and bleeding, the splintered wood mocking my efforts. I clawed at the shuttered windows, my nails breaking against the wood. My rage was a wildfire, burning hot and fast. And when it finally exhausted itself, it left behind nothing but the cold, gray ash of despair. I curled up on the dusty floor, the crushing weight of Liam's betrayal, a physical force pressing down on me. My mind replayed every moment of our 5 years together, searching for the clues I had missed. Every loving glance, every whispered promise was now tainted, recast as a calculated move in a long, predatory game. He hadn't loved me. He had cultivated me. I was not his partner. I was his most valuable asset, a resource to be exploited and then discarded. The man I had loved had never actually existed. He was a forgery, and I, the world-renowned authenticator, had been completely, utterly fooled. As the second day dawned, painting thin slivers of gray light through the cracks in the shutters, a different part of my brain began to stir. It was the scientist, the geologist, the part of me that did not deal in emotion, but in data, observation, and analysis. Panic was a luxury I could no longer afford. Despair was a death sentence. If I was going to die here, I would not die as Liam's hysterical, heartbroken victim. I would die as Dr. Iris Thorne. I stood up, my movements stiff and deliberate. I began a systematic survey of my prison. The cabin was roughly 20 feet by 15. The walls were thick, interlocking logs, chinked with a cement-like mortar that had hardened to the consistency of rock. The floor was packed with earth, cold and damp. The fireplace was solid stone, expertly constructed. The roof was high and dark, lost in shadows. There was no way out through the walls, the door, or the windows. My resources were grim. Liam had left me with nothing. No food, no water, no tools. My pockets contained only a small pocket knife I always carried, a book of waterproof matches, and a few crumpled tissues. The only other object in the cabin was the rickety table and the bunk bed frame, both made of rough-hewn pine. My first priority was water. I remembered the dampness of the floor. Using my pocket knife, I began to scrape at the packed earth in the darkest corner of the cabin. It was slow, agonizing work. After an hour, my hands raw, I had dug a small pit about a foot deep. I sat and waited. Over the next few hours, slowly, miraculously, a small amount of murky, silt-filled water began to seep into the bottom of the hole. It was a victory. It tasted of earth and stone, but it was life, with the immediate threat of dehydration managed. My mind turned to the structure itself. I began to examine the cabin not as a prisoner, but as a geologist. I ran my hands over the stone of the fireplace. It was local granite, solid and impenetrable. I studied the mortar between the logs. It was old, but it was strong. But the foundation... The cabin was built on a slight slope, and the foundation was a simple stacked stone affair. It was here, at the base, where the structure met the earth, that a weakness might exist. I spent the next 2 days meticulously examining every inch of the cabin's base. I tapped stones, scraped at the mortar, and used the blade of my knife to probe the gaps. On the afternoon of the 4th day, I found it. Behind the stone hearth of the fireplace, at the very back of the cabin, one of the large foundation stones felt slightly loose. When I pushed against it with all my weight, it shifted, just a fraction of an inch, with a low, grinding sound. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through me. This was it. This was my way out for the next 3 days I worked. With a single-minded, obsessive focus, I used the leg of the rickety table as a lever, wedging it into the crack beside the loose stone. I used my body weight, my muscles screaming in protest, to push and pry. I scraped away the mortar with my knife until the blade was dull and my fingers were numb. It was a battle of human will against the patient, stubborn weight of the stone. As I worked, I found something else. Tucked into a crevice behind the stone was a small oilskin-wrapped bundle. My heart pounded as I unwrapped it. Inside was a small leather-bound journal and a tarnished silver compass. The journal belonged to the cabin's original occupant, a ranger named Thomas Glass, and it was dated 1932. His entries were brief and practical, notes on weather patterns, animal sightings, and the slow, solitary life of a man in the wilderness. But the last few pages were different. His handwriting became frantic, almost illegible. He wrote of a sickness in the rock, a strange tremor in the mountain. Mount wasn't. An earthquake. He described a whispering cave deep behind the cabin, a place where the air grew warm and the rocks hummed with a strange energy. He believed the mountain was waking up. His final entry was chilling. The ground gave way. The main tunnel is gone. Trapped. The back way is my only hope. God help me. He had been trapped. Just like me. But he knew of a back way. My work on the stone took on a new urgency. I wasn't just trying to escape the cabin anymore. I was trying to find Thomas Glass's whispering cave. On the morning of the 8th day of my imprisonment, with a final agonizing heave, the stone shifted. It moved just enough for me to squeeze my body into the dark, narrow space behind the fireplace. The air was cold and smelled of deep, damp earth. It was a narrow, natural fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for my shoulders. I lit one of my precious matches. The flickering light revealed a rough, descending tunnel. It was the back way. As I squeezed into the darkness, leaving the log cabin prison behind, I felt a profound shift within me. The heartbroken woman Liam had left to die was gone. In her place was a survivor, a woman who had listened to the language of the stone and found a secret it had held for nearly 100 years. I didn't know what lay ahead in the darkness, but for the first time in over a week, I was moving forward. I was no longer a victim waiting to die. I was a geologist, heading deep into the heart of the mountain that was supposed to be my grave. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It twisted and descended, a rough-hewn throat leading into the bowels of the earth. The darkness was absolute, a thick, palpable black that swallowed the feeble light of my matches as soon as I lit them. I used them sparingly, lighting one only. When the tunnel branched or the footing became too treacherous, navigating the rest of the time by touch, my hands scraping against the cold, damp rock. The silence was replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing and the steady, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead. I had been moving through the tunnels for what felt like hours, my sense of time completely gone when I first saw the light. It was a faint, pale glow far down the tunnel that flickered and danced like a captive spirit. My first thought was that I was hallucinating, my oxygen-deprived brain creating phantoms in the dark. But the light was steady. It was real. Hope and fear warred within me. Who could be down here? A rescue party? It seemed impossible. Liam had planned this too well. A fellow prisoner? The thought was terrifying. I extinguished the match one was holding and proceeded in darkness, my movement slow and silent dot as I drew closer. The tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. The source of the light was a series of lanterns, strategically placed, casting a warm, golden glow over an impossible scene. It was a camp. A home. There were shelves carved into the rock, stacked with canned goods, tools, and neatly folded blankets. A fire pit, carefully constructed under a natural fissure in the cavern ceiling that served as a chimney, glowed with embers. In the center of the cavern, a man sat at a rough wooden table, his back to me. Hunched over a map, he was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick, graying beard and hair that fell to his shoulders. He wore worn but functional clothes, a canvas jacket, sturdy trousers, and heavy boots. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy. A man completely at home in this impossible environment. I must have made a sound, a scuff of my boot on the stone. Because he froze. He didn't turn around. He simply said, his voice a low, calm rumble that echoed slightly in the vast space, "I wouldn't come any closer if I were you. The floor near the entrance is unstable." My heart hammered against my ribs. I was too weak, too exhausted to run. I leaned against the tunnel wall, my voice a dry whisper. Who are you?" He finally turned, and his eyes, when they met mine, were the most startling thing I had ever seen. They were a pale, piercing blue, filled not with malice, but with a profound, weary sadness. He looked at my torn clothes, my bruised and bloodied hands, my gaunt face, and his expression softened with something that looked like recognition. "My name is Elias," he said, "and I think you've had a very bad week." He stood up slowly, his hands held open and away from his body, a universal sign of peace. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." Over the next few hours, sitting by his fire, sipping a hot herbal tea he brewed from plants he grew in a small hydroponic garden lit by one of his lanterns, our stories unfurled. He was a former search and rescue team leader, a man who knew these mountains better than anyone. 5 years ago, the same amount of time I had been with Liam, his wife and 9-year-old daughter had been killed in a freak rockslide during a hike. He had been just a few 100 feet away, helpless to save them. Grief had shattered him. He blamed himself, blamed the mountains he had once loved. He had walked away from his life, from society, and retreated into the wilderness, seeking a silence loud enough to drown out the echoes of his guilt. He had found this cavern system through the same ranger's journal I had, and over the years, he had turned it into a sanctuary, his Hermitage. He was a ghost, just like me, a person who had been buried by the mountain. I told him my story. I told him about Liam, about the discovery, about the betrayal. He listened without interruption, his pale blue eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. I saw his tracks, Elias said finally, his voice low. 2 days after the storm, one set of tracks going up to the cabin, one set going down. I thought it was strange. I almost went to check, but I don't interfere with the world up there anymore. He looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a self-recrimination that I understood completely. "I should have. You couldn't have known," I whispered. "No," he said, his jaw tightening, "but I know men like him. Men who see the world not as something to live in, but as something to conquer, something to own. He didn't just leave you to die. He tried to erase you." Elias became my guide, my mentor in the art of survival. He taught me how to find edible roots in the dark, how to navigate by the subtle shifts in airflow through the tunnels, and how to read the language of the deep, earth that he had mastered. He was a scientist in his own right, his knowledge practical and hard-won. As my physical strength returned, a new, powerful resolve began to form within me. The desire for survival was slowly being replaced by a burning, all-consuming need for justice. There is a way out, Elias told me one evening as we studied the maps he had created of the vast cavern system. He pointed to a thin blue line on the parchment. An underground river. It flows for miles before emerging at the base of the mountain, far from here. It's dangerous. The water is freezing, the currents are treacherous, and parts of the passage are completely submerged. I've been down it once. I wasn't sure I would make it back. It's our only way, I said, my voice firm. There was no question in my mind. He looked at me, a flicker of something admiration perhaps in his sad eyes. It will take preparation. We'll need gear, rope, waterproof packs, more light. Then we prepare, I said, for the next week. We were a team. We worked together, our shared purpose creating a powerful, unspoken bond. We were two broken people, two ghosts haunting the same mountain, who had found in each other a reason to return to the world of the living. He was teaching me how to survive the wilderness, but I, in turn, was reminding him that there was a world worth surviving for. As we prepared for our perilous journey down the dark river, I knew I was no longer just fighting for my life. I was fighting for him, too. The journey to the river was a descent into an even deeper, more primal world. We moved through tunnels, carved not by man, but by millennia of seeping water. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of wet stone and ancient decay. The only sounds were the drip of water, the scuff of our boots, and the sound of our own breathing, amplified in the tight spaces. Elias moved with a silent, practiced grace, and I followed. Trusting his knowledge of this subterranean landscape implicitly, he led me to a vast, echoing chamber where the sound of rushing water was a deafening roar. In the beam of our headlamps, we saw it, the underground river, a churning black ribbon of water that disappeared into a dark, forbidding tunnel. It didn't look like water. It looked like a liquid night. The river is a beast, Elias said, his voice barely audible over the roar. It will try to crush you, to freeze you, to pull you under. You cannot fight it. You have to let it guide you, feel its currents, and use its own power to move. We packed our supplies, the journal, the compass, food, and dry clothes into waterproof sacks that Elias had fashioned from salvaged materials. We wore layers of wool and canvas, knowing that the cold would be our greatest enemy. Standing on the precipice of that dark water, I felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard resolve. Liam had left me in a silent, dry tomb. I would escape through a roaring, wet one. The moment we plunged into the water, the cold was a physical blow. It stole my breath and seized my muscles. The current was a powerful, living thing yanking at my limbs, trying to drag me down. For a terrifying moment, I panicked, my body struggling against the immense force. Then I heard Elias's voice in my head. Don't fight it. Let it guide you. I forced my body to relax, to become buoyant, and kicked with the current. Following the beam of his headlamp as it cut a path through the churning blackness, we moved through a world of surreal, nightmarish beauty. The tunnel walls were slick with algae and glittered with mineral deposits that caught our headlamp beams like scattered jewels. We passed through vast caverns where the ceiling was 100 feet high, adorned with ghostly white stalactites, like the teeth of some great sleeping beast. At other times, the passage narrowed so much that we had to turn sideways, our packs scraping against the rock, the ceiling just inches above our heads. The most terrifying part was the submerged tunnel. Elias had warned me about it. A section of the passage, about 50 feet long, where the roof dipped below the waterline. There was no air. We would have to pull ourselves along a guide rope he had anchored on his first trip, holding our breath, for what would feel like an eternity. When we reached it, my heart hammered against my ribs. Elias checked the rope, ensuring it was still secure. He looked at me, his blue eyes calm and steady in the beam of my headlamp. Deep breath, Cerise, he said. Stay calm. Keep pulling. I will be right behind you. He took a final deep breath and vanished beneath the surface. I watched his light disappear. I was alone in the roaring dark. I counted to 10, filled my own lungs until they burned, and plunged into the icy blackness. The world vanished. There was only the rope in my numb hands, the crushing pressure of the water, and the screaming of my lungs for air. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind. I fought it down, focusing only on the next handhold, the next pull. My vision began to tunnel, black spots dancing before my eyes. Just as I felt my consciousness begin to slip away, I saw it, the faint, wavering glow of Elias's headlamp. I gave one last desperate kick and my head broke the surface. I gasped, choking on air and water, my body shaking uncontrollably. Elias was there, his strong arms pulling me onto a rocky ledge. I made it. We both had. We lay there for a long time, wrapped in emergency blankets, our bodies trembling with cold and adrenaline. The roar of the river, a constant thunderous applause dot as we rested. A new kind of silence fell between us. It wasn't the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of shared survival, a bond forged in the darkest of places. When we get out of here, I said, my voice hoarse, I'm not just going to the police. I'm going to destroy him, Elias. I'm going to take back everything he stole from me. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. I know you will, he said, but you won't be doing it alone. The rest of the journey was a slow, upward climb. The river's roar began to fade, replaced by a new sound, the faint, distant whisper of wind. The air changed, losing its subterranean dampness, tasting of pine and open space. After another day of climbing through dry, ascending tunnels, we saw it. Not a lantern's glow, but a pale, gray light filtering through a curtain of thick roots and vines. Elias pushed them aside and held them for me. I stepped through out of the darkness and into the dawn. The world was breathtaking. We were on a high ledge, overlooking a valley shrouded in morning mist. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of cedar and damp earth. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in strokes of rose and gold. I took a deep breath, the clean, cold air a shock to my lungs. I had been in the dark for so long, I had forgotten the beauty of the light. I turned to Elias. He was standing beside me, his face turned towards the sunrise, and the weary sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something I hadn't seen before. It was hope that we had survived the mountain. We walked through the grave and came out the other side. Now it was time to face the man who had put me there. We started the long walk down towards the distant, sleeping town, no longer ghosts, but survivors with a reckoning to deliver. Returning to civilization was a violent sensory assault. The noise of cars, the smells of exhaust and fried food, the press of anonymous bodies on a sidewalk, it was all overwhelming after the profound silence of the mountain. We bought clean clothes at a thrift store and got a room in a cheap motel. The first thing I did was get online. It took less than 5 minutes to find him. Liam, my charming, sociopathic Liam, was no longer just an aspiring entrepreneur. He was the celebrated new face of green technology. Apex Minerals was front-page news in every major financial journal. He had held a press conference just a week ago, his face, tanned and confident, beaming from the screen. I watched the video, my hands clenched into fists. He announced the discovery of the Apex deposit, the richest source of rare earth metals in the Western Hemisphere. He spoke of his vision, his relentless pursuit of a cleaner future. And then he spoke of me. His voice dropped, his face becoming a mask of tragic sorrow. He spoke of his brilliant partner, Dr. Iris Thorne, a woman who had dedicated her life to the earth. He told the world that I had tragically died in a sudden, violent storm during a geological survey, that I had been swept away by a rock slide while protecting the precious data. He had barely escaped with his own life, he said, a tear glistening in his eye. He was dedicating the entire project, his life's work, to my memory. Apex Minerals, he declared, is Iris's legacy. The audacity, the sheer, monstrous hypocrisy of it left me breathless. He hadn't just tried to kill me. He had stolen my life, my work, my name, and was now wearing my legacy like a martyr's cloak. He's giving a keynote address, Elias said, reading over my shoulder from a news site, at the Global Mining and Technology Summit in San Francisco. In 2 days, he's officially announcing the first round of investor funding. That's where we'll do it, I said, my voice cold and hard as the granite I had slept on. Not in a police station, not in a lawyer's office, in front of them all. In front of the world he's so desperate to impress. The next 48 hours were a blur of calculated preparation. Elias, using his old contacts in the rescue community, found a trusted, retired sheriff who listened to our story with growing horror. We didn't want to spook Liam by having uniformed officers show up. The plan had to be executed with surgical precision. I spent hours on the phone with my university's legal department and a patent lawyer, explaining the situation. The original data, my decades of research, was all backed up on university servers, time-stamped and secure. My intellectual property was ironclad. The day of the summit, I felt a strange, zen-like calm. I was no longer the victim, I was the reckoning. I chose my outfit with care, a simple, dark gray suit, professional and severe. I was not there to be mourned, I was there to work. Elias stood beside me, a quiet, solid presence. He wasn't just my witness. He was my anchor. We walked into the massive convention hall, our credentials arranged by the old sheriff, getting us past security without a problem. The room was packed with hundreds of investors, journalists, and industry titans. On the stage, a massive screen displayed the Apex Minerals logo over a stunning photograph of the Sierra Nevada, my photograph. And there's Liam, in the center of the stage, basking in the spotlight. He was in his element, charming the audience, painting a beautiful picture of a future powered by his discovery. He was just reaching the crescendo of his speech. And so, he said, his voice ringing with passion, while my heart breaks for the personal loss of my brilliant partner, Dr. Iris Thorne. Her spirit, her legacy, lives on in this project. It is in her memory that we will build a better, cleaner world. That was my cue. I began to walk, not from the back of the auditorium, but from the side entrance near the stage, as we had planned. A single spotlight operator, tipped off by our contact, picked me up. A murmur rippled through the crowd as a woman in a gray suit began walking, calmly and deliberately towards the stage. Liam didn't see me at first. He was lost in the applause he was anticipating. But the murmur grew, becoming a wave of confused whispers. He faltered, his smile wavering as he looked out at the audience, trying to understand the source of the disruption, and then he saw me. The transformation of his face was the most satisfying thing I have ever witnessed. The confident smile, the passionate zeal, the feigned grief, it all evaporated in an instant. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, terrified mask. He looked like a man who had not just seen a ghost, but had seen his own damnation walking towards him in sensible shoes. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked up the stairs to the stage and stood beside him at the podium, taking the second microphone. The entire hall was utterly, completely silent. I looked out at the sea of stunned faces. Then I looked at the man who had left me to die. My name, I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the massive hall, is Dr. Iris Thorne, and reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. A collective gasp went through the audience. Liam was frozen, paralyzed, his mind unable to compute what was happening. The man standing beside me, Liam Carter, is not a visionary, I continued, my voice gaining strength. He is a thief, a fraud, and an attempted murderer. The Apex deposit is not his discovery. It is the result of my life's work, which he stole. He did not lose me to a tragic accident. He drugged me and sealed me inside a ranger's cabin in the Sierra Nevada, leaving me to die so he could claim my research as his own. Two plainclothes officers who had been waiting in the wings walked calmly onto the stage and stood on either side of Liam. He didn't even seem to notice them. He was still staring at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pure terror and disbelief. My legacy, I said, my final words directed at him, is not something you get to dedicate. My legacy is that I survived you. As the officers took his arms and led him away, a stunned and broken man, the silence in the room finally broke. The frantic clicking of cameras and the roar of journalists shouting questions was deafening. In the chaotic aftermath, Elias was there. He simply put a hand on my shoulder, a quiet, grounding touch in the middle of the storm. We walked away from the stage, leaving the wreckage of Liam's life behind. The legal battles were long, but the evidence was overwhelming. My data, the Rangers, journal, Elias's testimony, it was an open and shut case. Liam was sentenced to life in prison. Apex Minerals dissolved, its assets frozen. I reclaimed my work, but I didn't do it for a corporation. With Elias by my side, we established the Thornglass Foundation, named for myself and the long-dead ranger who had left me the first clue. It was a nonprofit dedicated to ethical scientific discovery and wilderness preservation. We used the data from the deposit not to create a corporate empire, but to pioneer new, sustainable extraction methods and fund environmental protection programs throughout the Sierras. My life was no longer quiet. It was filled with purpose, with work that mattered, and with a partnership built not on lies and ambition, but on shared survival and mutual respect. I had walked into the heart of the mountain and faced the darkest parts of human nature. I had been buried, erased, and left for dead. But the mountain hadn't claimed me. It had forged me. And in the end, I was the one who came back stronger. My spirit as patient, as resilient, and as unyielding as the stone itself.